Additionally, if you keep the yoke, for example, pushed forward, the use of the trim will not reduce the amount of force needed to keep the yoke in that position. It will only increase the effect of the pitch input. And this is different than the way that the trim works in some smaller aircraft, where it is the position of the yoke that is actually being reset. The electrical trim also moves faster when the flaps are extended, and all of these facts will soon become super important. Anyway, the use of the trim helped the captain to quickly reduce the pitch with around 4 degrees, and with that came an even faster acceleration. Remember, the aircraft was still flying with the gear down on flaps 30 at this point, so the acceleration meant that the maximum speed of 175 knots was now fast approaching. At times 0242 and 34 seconds, the aircraft shot through the go-around altitude slightly, and the speed also increased momentarily to 182 knots, which the first officer pointed out. This activated the flap load relief function, which automatically reduced the flaps from 30 to 25 degrees to save the flaps from the overspeed, but this was likely not even noticed by the crew. Instead, the captain descended slightly back to 2,300 feet and started a rather lengthy discussion with the first officer about if they had actually busted the flap speed restriction or not. Remember, the gear and the flaps were still extended here, and the wind shear alert was actually still showing, even though the conditions were now much better. The two pilots agreed that they had likely busted the maximum speed, and the captain said that he would call for maintenance to check it out once they were back on the ground. This all shows a good and professional attitude from the captain, and even though it would likely have been a good idea to wait with that discussion until after the aircraft was cleaned up and the go-around was complete, I can kind of understand what they were worried about here. Anyway, the crew now got back into contact with the approach controller and requested further climb since they were still in quite heavy turbulence. It took them a few attempts to actually get the controller to understand what they wanted, likely because of the controller's poor English, but eventually they were cleared to climb to 5,000 feet. The captain engaged the autopilot and autothrottle, started accelerating, and then asked for the gear and the flaps to be retracted. Now, this might have all seemed quite messy, but actually it wasn't that badly handled at all. The approach had been well flown, they reacted correctly to the warning, and even though they slightly oversped the flaps and overshot the go-around altitude a little bit, a wind shear escape maneuver is tricky to fly, and it's very rarely flown outside of the simulator. So up until this point, the flight had been handled relatively well. But it is likely that the captain was very frustrated by the fact that he'd been forced to do this maneuver and that he wasn't able to land. That was shown when he later talked to one of the cabin crew members, where he mentioned several times that he had been forced to go around because of procedures, and that if it wasn't for that predictive warning, he would have likely been able to land just fine. This mindset of the captain, how sure he was that he would have been able to land, is important to keep in mind. The controller told the crew to continue towards a navigate called Bravo Alpha, since they were now number 2 in the approach behind an Aeroflot aircraft that was about to start their approach. He also asked the crew what the reason for the go-around was, and they just answered wind shear. They also told the controller that they needed to maintain their present heading due to weather, and they asked for further climb to avoid the moderate icing which they now find themselves in. This was approved, and they continued their climb to flight level 80. Once the weather avoidance was complete, the aircraft proceeded towards Bravo Alpha as cleared, and the pilots now started discussing whether or not they should try for another approach immediately or wait a while for the wind shear condition to hopefully move away. The captain indicated that he wanted to hear how the Aeroflot aircraft ahead of them would do before he made his mind up about this, and that's a very sensible thing to do. They had plenty of fuel, so they were in no rush at this point. The controllers soon came back and informed them that the Aeroflot aircraft had also gone around due to wind shear, and this just cemented the crew's opinion that it would be better to wait around a bit. They had around 9 tons of fuel still on board, which was enough to wait more than 2 hours before they would be required to divert. The captain proceeded to give a PA to the passengers, where he explained the reason for their go-around and the fact that they would likely now have to hold for a while to wait for better weather. After that, the pilots tried to ask for a holding area to the north of the airport instead due to the bad weather at their current position, and they also started moving in that direction whilst constantly discussing the vectors with the controller, who was struggling badly to understand what they wanted to do. So badly, in fact, that another controller had to step in and help at one point. At the same time, the Aeroflot aircraft was attempting a second approach, and about 10 minutes after they had left the approach frequency, they came back again, reporting that they had been forced to make another go-around due to wind shear. This was just a further confirmation that the bad weather was still very much present over the airport, so Flight 981 just continued waiting, eventually climbing up to flight level 150 and establishing themselves in a holding pattern over the Mike November NDB to the southwest of the aerodrome. The Aeroflot flight had not given up yet though, and at time 0316 they went around for the third time, and after that they finally decided to divert to their alternate. Things definitely weren't looking very good at this point, so the pilots of Flight Dubai 981 started taking weather information for their alternate Volgograd in case it would be needed. They still had plenty of fuel in the tanks, and from what they could see on their weather radar, the weather was actually getting a little bit better in Rostov-on-Don, so the captain suggested that they should wait a bit more, then maybe shoot another approach, and then, if that was unsuccessful, they could divert. After a while in holding, the captain left the cockpits to go to the toilet, and while he was gone, the first officer was joined in the cockpit by a junior cabin crew member. They were both Spanish, so they started discussing the situation, and from that conversation you could clearly hear that the first officer was not very happy about staying and waiting in the holding. He was not as convinced as the captain about the improving weather, and he thought it would be a better idea to just divert to the alternate. Now, this was after 1.5 hours in the holding, so I can kind of understand where he was coming from. When the captain came back into the cockpits, they took more alternate weather, this time for Mineralnie Vodi, which looked even better, so they decided that this would be where they were going to divert in case they ultimately couldn't get in. The captain also got into contact with Fly Dubai Operations Control via satellite phone to let them know about the status, and they agreed with his assessment and also recommended them to hold in the hold as long as possible and then try another approach if they felt comfortable. So why was this so important? Why didn't they just give up and fly to the alternate? Well, as a pilot, you always aim to perform your objective, which is to safely get your aircraft, passengers and crew to the destination. A diversion would mean a lot of hassle for everyone. The passengers would have to be given alternate means of transportation, the crew would likely run out of hours, which would mean an overnight, and the outbound passengers would then have to either be severely delayed or maybe get their flight even cancelled. All of this, together with the fact that the captain had been visual with the runway on his previous approach and was pretty sure that he would have been able to land, was likely behind his willingness to stay and wait. But in that way of thinking, there might have also now started to form a bias in the captain's mind, a kind of preset plan of how the next approach would turn out, and that could be important. We will get to this second approach very soon, but first, have you ever heard the phrase that someone is being behind the aircraft? Now, this is a term that explains the feeling of being behind what is going on and constantly having to react to things that you weren't expecting. This is a state of mind that is very common in the start of almost every career, where everything is new and sometimes can feel really overwhelming. In an ideal situation, we pilots should always be slightly ahead of the aircraft and anticipate what will be happening next. This is why we prepare so much for each flight and brief so thoroughly before each approach and departure. If we are ahead of the aircraft, well, then we will have spare capacity to deal with anything unexpected, and we also have a much wider attention span. But if we fall behind the aircraft, almost all of our mental capacity will be spent trying to understand what is happening, and since we, because of that, won't be able to accurately deal with the situation, it might become worse and push us even further behind, ending up in a vicious cycle. Now, the way to deal with this is often to just stop whatever it is that you're doing, taking a deep breath, and then get back to following a trained routine, which is why we have so many procedures and checklists in aviation. After the aircraft had been holding for almost 2 hours, the crew finally started to get ready for their next approach. They had entered the diversion routing into the FMC, prepared the charts, and they had also set the new approach reference speeds and recalculated their landing performance. The captain again very quickly briefed the approach and mentioned to the first officer that in case of a wind shear this time, they would do exactly what they did before. go around, no